And we finish with a very powerful paper indeed. Daryl's back at the podium to talk about the POWs in Rangoon Jail. Daryl.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm always moved when I read that chapter. Well, most of us know about the Tai Railway and Changi, etc., etc., etc. But very few of us will know about the Australians who were captured in Burma and who were held in the Rangoon Jail. The first three I will briefly mention were soldiers. So two of them were escaped from Singapore, trying to make their way on rafts to India, and one of them after 68 days on a raft with your fellow soldiers. Imagine that, thank you very much. They washed ashore on the shore in Moran and were captured. So Douglas Eastgate and Victor Hudson, whose picture's not here. I thought there was another two pictures, but that's okay, we might read about those. And the third one was Private Kenneth Bryson, who was part of the Chult Force. There were three soldiers left behind. They were quite ill and weren't able to be brought out with the rest. Two of them were killed in action against the Japanese, and Bryson ended up being captured in early 1942, and he, because he didn't want to let on that there'd been other Australians there, he said that he'd escaped from Malaya. So it was sort of the general area, it was just he'd been captured from Burma. But those three Australians were soon joined by 12 others, and I want to talk a little bit about their stories. So there were 12 RAAF men who found themselves in the Rangoon Jail, all through interesting circumstances. So there were five main causes really, and again we've talked about the terrible conditions that existed at times. Aircraft mechanical failure or misadventure resulted in 5 of them being POWs. Warrant Officer James Coppin, who was the wireless operator on 60 Squadron, was in a Blenheim. So a Blenheim bomber has only 3 crew: a pilot who's sitting up in a glass cupola, a navigator who's sort of down at the bottom right, and an air gunner who's in a blister at the back of the plane. Coppin's Blenheim is doing low-level bombing in the coastal town of Akyad. They're over the airport, they drop some bombs. The bombs explode prematurely, blowing their own plane to smithereens. The plane crashes on the aerodrome. The front 2 are killed, but Coppin survives. He describes being pulled from the wreckage and immediately beaten and interrogated by the Japanese before he finds himself in Rangoon Jail. 4 RAAF POW resulted from enemy action. Flight Sergeant John Reed, have that photo, and Sergeant Wilson were crew members of a Blenheim bomber of 113 Squadron, and it was hit by a flak and fighter. When you read the book, you'll see an unbelievable photograph taken by another plane in the squadron. It's taken looking back, and it shows Reed's plane that's been hit by ACAC fire, just sort of doing a loop before it eventually crash lands. It's the most amazing photograph. We thank John Morman, who's a researcher in Adelaide, who provided us with it. All of them were also captured, and shot down on the same raid was a Hudson pilot named Kenneth White. We'll hear more of him later. A mid-air collision occurred which resulted in the capture of Warrant Officer Besley, Squadron Leader Matheson. Simply in flight, one plane flew up into another and they were locked together. The 2 pilots managed to parachute out. The rest of the crew were killed when the plane crashed. And quite remarkably, the Japanese retrieved the bodies, buried them, and marked their grave with honour, because they were, and marked it as with brave British warriors. Quite a remarkable thing. As happens in the fog of war, a bow fighter pilot, Ernest Trigwell, was shot down in November 1944 by friendly fire when two American Lightning fighters mistook his plane and a bow fighter for Japanese planes, and they were again shot down by friendly fire. Sometimes pilot error occurs, and the last Australian who was captured was Wing Commander Lionel Hudson, Bill Hudson. He had just taken over command of 82 Squadron, and Mosquitoes had just been allowed to fly again, and so he was out just having a bit of a practice run. He flew too low, hit the Irrawaddy River, the plane crashed, and he was captured. So he was the last one. He was captured in December 1944. And he joined 12 others who'd been captured and were being held in the Rangoon Jail. So the Thai-Burma Railway has come very much to symbolise the Australian POW experience. And historian Paul Ham wrote about the way in which the Japanese army maintained complete power over their own soldiers. They, the Japanese soldiers, were slapped or beaten routinely by any lapse in discipline. And this was an extension of the ferocious corporal punishment that applied in Japanese boys' schools of the day, where men were treated like animals and they had to be taught a lesson. So as the RAAF prisoners in Rangoon soon discovered, their treatment reflected these aspects of Japanese culture. Because it was a huge disgrace to the Japanese to be a prisoner, the Japanese did not publish the names of the RAAF men who'd been captured. And so they did not allow the prisoners to write letters or receive letters. So for years, families back here in Australia did not know if their RAAF loved one who was being designated as missing was alive or not. Regardless of wounds and injuries, almost immediately after capture, as we know in Copland's case, the cruel punishments, the interrogations of the POW began. Two flyers were tied up, thrown to the ground, and left there for hours whilst Japanese troops were able to beat, bash, kick and humiliate them. Regardless of wounds, the interrogations also began, and name, rank, serial number were not enough. Solitary confinement and food deprivation in the Rangoon Jail was used to further humiliate the prisoners. Long periods of solitary confinement where the men could not even talk to anyone at all. The inventive Australians soon invented what they called skywriting, which meant that from cell to cell they would quietly write letters of the alphabet in the air so that messages could be transported or translated from one end of the jail to the other. Clearly they weren't going to be spelling hippopotamus or supercalifragilistic, but you know what I mean, you get the gist. So strict were the solitary confinement conditions that many of the RAAF crew did not know for years there were other Australians in the prison. No bedding was provided, no extra clothing was issued. So some men, when they were released, were still wearing the clothing in which they'd been captured years before. The usual ration of food was that prisoners might receive 2 or 3 daily meals just of rice, and a third meal which might contain some egg fruit, marrow, a little grain, but because it was the grain that was used to feed the mules, it wasn't always palatable. Continual beatings took place, and at times the prisoners were made to beat each other and were severely punished if they underperformed. All the Allied officers and NCOs were given a screed from which they had to familiarise themselves in Japanese with the different phrases and orders for parades or drill. The prisoners also soon learned not to miss bowing to the sentries and guards, because the penalty for not doing so was to be taken out and beaten. The war was ever present, and on the night of 29th November 1942, RAAF Sergeant Ken White was killed during an Allied bombing raid on Rangoon, along with 9 other prisoners. So in mid-1944, the Japanese treatment of captured aircrew became even harsher as the Japanese tried to compensate for the loss of face because their own air forces were being well and truly beaten. So, eventually in 1945, as the British 14th Army forces steadily made their way towards Rangoon, on the 25th of April, a significant day for Australians, the Japanese asked for the names of all those in the compound who could walk as they were planning to march them north and away from Rangoon. 5 RAAF POWs and 2 of the soldiers, with a total of 400 other fit Allied POW, walked out of the jail that afternoon. The remaining RAAF POW and soldiers stayed behind because they were far too unwell and unfit to leave. And this meant that the RAAF's Wing Commander, Bill Hudson, was now the senior officer in the jail. On the night of the 29th of April, the Japanese guards sneaked off without warning, leaving a note to say that all the prisoners were now free and informing Hudson where they placed the keys to the jail. So by unbelievably exceptional circumstances, RAAF Wing Commander Bill Hudson now became the most senior Allied officer in the Rangoon Jail, and by default, the entire city itself. In the days that followed, until the British arrived, Hudson ordered the prison be locked up to secure the safety of the prisoners because of the chaos happening in Rangoon. He quickly organised for urgent medical aid and provisions, and he arranged for large signs to be painted on the roof saying, "Japs gone and British here," to advise the RAF and an American air crew of the presence and the changed situation. But only a day or so later, an RAF Beaufighter bombed much too close to the jail. So Hudson had the 2 words, "extract digit," painted on the roof. I probably don't need to explain the Australian colloquialism, but what he was trying to indicate was that the Japanese would never use such a phrase, and it was clearly British and Australians who were there. If you read the official RAAF history of the war, it would never use extract digit. And it has this beautiful sentence where it talks about when Commander Hudson had a phrase colloquially used by British servicemen to indicate speed was required. And he's quite right. So, as the king of Rangoon, Hudson bluffed his way into securing the cooperation of the Indian National Army. There were 1,000 Indian National Army in Rangoon, and the Burma Defence Army headed by Aung San. And Hudson did it like this. There's a wonderful photo of Hudson after his release. He looks like Billy from the bush, and he's still wearing his slides of rank. He should not have been worn. He said he should have taken them off. But he met the leaders of the INA and the Burma Defence Army, and he's gone, "I represent Mountbatten, so you better do what I ask because they'll be here soon." And they all went, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." And incredibly provided all the POWs with arms and ammunition to defend themselves. It's almost Hogan's Heroes, isn't it? Well, amidst the chaos, 2 RAF officers suddenly appeared at the jail, and they in turn negotiated a halt with the Navy who were about to bombard Rangoon. The jail and the city of Rangoon was liberated on the 5th of May, and the prisoners were taken by ship to Calcutta and Bombay and then repatriated back to Australia. Others remained in hospital for desperately needed treatment. Those men that had embarked on the march eventually escaped from the main party and were reunited with Allied forces, where they also received much needed medical treatment. One of the letters from one of the Air Force guys said, you know, we looked like we'd been through hell because we had been, clothing, I don't think so, mud, and we walked into this British Army camp and they thought we'd come from Mars. But we spoke English, they spoke English, and they said it was the greatest day of my life. In time, all the former Rangoon Jail inmates returned to Australia, and after years without news for many of these families, they at last received the joyful message: missing, now recovered as POW. Thank you.
Thank you again, Daryl, and thank you very much to Ian and Jacqueline.